Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought it would be worth going over the hopes that I have for Gamescom 2019. Remember, the difference between predictions and hopes is that predictions is what I think is going to happen, and hopes is what I would like to happen. Before we get started into this video, I do want to make a clarification from yesterday. So I got a message from another Xbox member called King TS, and he says, so you are able to join squadrons on an Xbox account if you are on PC, which is awesome, and you are also able to get the content creator decals and all that good stuff. You can also research squadron vehicles. So therefore, it seems like the ability to link your Xbox to PC has been an overall positive move so far, meaning that you can use the Gaijin store for GE and also be able to research the squadron vehicles by being in squadrons. That is wonderful. It's a great step forward for the Xbox community, and hopefully there are some more steps forward in the near future. But overall, incredibly positive step. So, let's go through the general ideas and hopes that I have for Gamescom. A lot of the time I'm going to be talking about mechanics or types of vehicles here, instead of focusing on specific vehicles, looking more at generalities, because at the moment, in-game, that's what, I'd like to see, more mechanics, more interesting ideas, and so forth. So, the first one is just more of an expansion on armored cars. We've seen more armored cars be added to the game over the last few years. The SDKFC series, of course, the 234s. We've seen the Daimlers. We've seen the AEC, now of course the stuff such as the M8, but what I would like to say is why not have stuff like the Deerhound in-game, which is very similar to the Boarhound, but of course different. Then you've got the Soviet armored cars, the BA-11 and all of its different variants. The BA-11 that you see here is armed with a 45mm, so it would fit incredibly well at rank 1. Then you have stuff like the SDKFC 222, which of course had itself a 20mm. All of these would be incredibly fun, low-tier vehicles, which you could run around in. And yes, maybe with the Deerhound you could scout with it since it would be rank 2, but the main thing is just to give a little ounce of new gameplay to whoever is new to the game. Do you remember when the little squeezy boy for the Germans was added? How nice it was to have something different at that tier. Even though they have a lot of autocannons and stuff at low-tier Germany, it's still nice to try something different, and the squeezy boy was that. Hopefully every nation can get their own squeezy boy in the form of an armored car. There is also some other more modern armored cars which would be nice to see, such as the Saladin, which you see here. We've talked about the Saladin extensively, and I think it would be a great recon/scout vehicle in the game right now. The next idea is going back to World War I. So after looking at armored cars from mainly World War II, but also, further on, going back in history as well, now that we have Naval, is a definite possibility. We already have a lot of ships which are around for that time period, so why not add a few more? This is an insect class machine. It's basically a machine which has a decent gun on the front of it. It has other armaments around it as well, but the main thing is that it's one of these, I suppose you'd class it as battle boats, which is it would be useful in game, but it wouldn't be the best because of the issues of its speed and also the issue of its armor. One thing that you do have, which is nice in Naval, is you have a lot of competent machines when it comes to World War I. When it comes to aircraft, you have the same, but with tanks, it of course struggles because a lot of tanks of the era were not designed to kill tanks. Instead, they were designed much more to go after enemy trenches and be much more of an offensive battering ram compared to anything else, until we get some of the later models. Anyway, I thought the insect class, this was passed by the developers, passed to the developers a while back. It would be lovely to see. You can see it's armed mainly with a 6-inch Mark 7 gun, and then also a 12-pounder gun, which is just sat above it. And why not, Why not have some more expansion of different classes of ships to try and, fill out the naval tech trees? It also has another 6-incher on the back, meaning that it has 2 major guns, plus, obviously the gun sat here. The next one, as I already mentioned, is World War I planes. World War I planes is something that has been done in other games to relative success, but with the expansion of War Thunder, when you look at the modern vehicles that it's been able to add, when you look at the vehicles from World War II it's been able to add. World War One vehicles are always tantalizing because eventually, if you go modern, yes, there's a ton of variations. Yes, there's a ton of, different machines, different prototypes, and even blueprint vehicles if you wanted to go that far. There's a ton of these that you could easily add. But for World War One, especially for planes and ships, you have a lot or a plethora of vehicles that you can choose from, which would be really fun to play. A lot of these biplanes from World War One, incredibly maneuverable, don't have a ton of armament, and therefore you would have these very tight, very quick and fast and nippy battles, which would be really fun to play because of the maneuverability of the machines. Now, the only issue is obviously monetizing World War One vehicles. You can't just slap in a $60 premium for something which would be effectively negative reserve. So instead, you'd have to do some kind of either expansion pass or some kind of a system where if you pay in, you get them early, like an early access model, which I know nobody's going to be happy with, but we do have to work out how to monetize this from the business point of view. They can't just have a system where everything is given out for free. So at least have a think about that idea, because I would love to see World War One planes in the game. I just haven't ever had a convincing argument about how to monetize it effectively. The next one is new maps. Now, by new maps, I actually mean old maps. So if you don't know, obviously there are times in history where people are not at war. Quite a lot of time in history where the majority of nations are not at war. And what this breeds is wonderful innovation. A lot of people, running about the place, a lot of industry, a lot of great stuff going on. And why not try and represent that in War Thunder by picking up different cities or different places which are not war-torn, which are not being fought over at that given time. The Berlin map in War Thunder is incredibly downtrodden. The idea of it is that it's 1945 Berlin, the last stretch of the Germans where they're getting absolutely battered and they're eventually going to surrender. It's around the Reichstag. The idea is there's been a battle being fought over it for many months, many weeks, however long. And that means that the surrounding area is just completely decimated. Well, what if you had a situation where you had a map which was it rebuilt, or different parts of Berlin from the 1930s. Now, obviously, you could get rid of all of the, let's just say, dodgy parts of it. Unfortunately, certain signs or certain insignias which are not allowed. But you could definitely set up a situation where you have a 1930s city which isn't war-torn, which is just instead incredibly new and incredibly brimming. Think about the ideas from American Desert, where you have all of the different shops, you can see all of the different things, and then after a while, when you've been fighting in it, it slowly gets destroyed by you shooting the buildings or hitting them with artillery. Take those ideas from those modern maps, such as American Desert and Alaska, and apply them to maps from the 1930s and 1920s. Because I would love to see trams, I would love to see buses, I would love to see a map from London, which shows stuff like the double-decker open-top buses, those around the streets. I would just love to see all of these things in War Thunder, so you could fight around them, giving you a sense of war, because you're obviously fighting against the enemy, but at the same time, a sense of history and a sense of learning what the areas of the 20s and 30s were like when they weren't war-torn. I think that would be great overall. I think that would be absolutely wonderful. The next one is incredibly zoomed in, and it's the idea of paratroopers. So if I've talked about paratroopers a lot in the past, and let's just get that video here. I've talked about paratroopers a lot in the past. This is one of the examples that I worked through, and the general example, this is Paradise Island, and the idea is is from either side of the island, you have paratroopers coming in, they capture specific points, and then the planes which bring in the paratroopers turn around and go away, and then you have to either destroy the paratroopers once they've landed and been able to set up their foundations, or you try and take them out before they are even landed, so take out the planes themselves. This would add an additional objective onto the map itself. It would also mean that there is something else to fight over. And if you give this simultaneously to both sides, therefore, it can definitely be balanced. On top of this, if you only want to give this to one side, then it would still provide points to fight around. So I did a series of videos talking about AI paratrooper objectives. If you want to go and have a look at them, please do. It basically goes through these general concepts at a much deeper level, and I go through many different examples of how this could work in a very not easy way, but in a very what I would see as balanced way. Giving both sides the opportunity to be able to deal with this threat in one way or another. So yeah, paratroopers I think would be lovely to see. Hopefully one day we do see them in a decent capacity, since we do have paratrooping planes or transport planes in the files. Why not try and expand them and use them in a mode like Aerialistic, which hasn't had a ton of new mechanics for it over the last few years when it comes to the maps. When it comes to the planes, yes, we've had supersonics, air-to-air missiles, air-to-ground missiles, and also radar. All of these wonderful additions, but at the same time, we don't have a lot to show for it when it comes to the maps themselves. So this would be a mechanic which would at least try and revolutionize how the maps work. The next one is parity. So I'm very interested in parity, always have been, and I think if you look at top tier when it comes to the top tier MBTs, over the last year or so, we've had much better parity when it comes to each nation and their top tier MBTs. Every nation now has a top tier MBT. The majority of nations have 2 or even 3, and this is great, right? This is much more what would be classed as balanced per nation, instead of a year ago where only a few nations had top tier MBTs. Well, now we're in a different situation but have the same problem. You have nations which have helicopters, and you have nations which don't. Now, yes, you have the AH-1S for the Japanese, but that is a paid vehicle, therefore it is out of the discussion here. So instead, what I would be asking for is a parity when it comes to helicopters. So I'd like to see British helicopters, I'd like to see Italian helicopters, or I would like to see Japanese helicopters. And at least when we have these tech trees sorted, then we can start talking about bouncing between vehicles. But right now, we have a situation where certain nations just don't have access to helicopters. It's as simple as that. You just don't flat out get the option for the helicopters. So I would like to see that addressed. So therefore, nations can get at least some more tools in their toolkit to face the enemy. The same goes for Naval. So this is the La Melpomen class torpedo boat. It's actually a very large torpedo boat with a decent sized gun on the front of it, but if you know anything about French torpedo boats, they are generally on the bigger side. But the main thing is, the French don't have a navy. The Italian also don't have a navy. So once again, from a parity point of view, let's get those into the game before we add anything else for the other nations, or at least use them as a main focus, so we can get some form of parity, and then we can start discussing whether certain nations need specific vehicles to, push on with actually balancing the game in its fullest. The next one is more light vehicles. So, as a person who's incredibly enjoyed the expansion of light vehicles over the last few years, with the forms of the BMPs, the Bradley, the Warrior, stuff like IFVs and light vehicles. It's been incredibly fun playing a lot of them in game. There's a few which are frustrating, mainly to face, like the RU, but that's still okay. It's I wish it got up BR'd a little bit, but you know how it is. But the scouting mechanic for me has revolutionized the way I personally play, and I see a lot of other people play. It means that if you're not good at aiming, or you struggle with aiming, you have a secondary option. which means that you can be useful without being normally useful in the general way, which is, of course, having a good KD or being able to kill people in the game. So I would like an expansion of these types of vehicles, obviously for the nations which need them. Britain doesn't have a lot of scout tanks, apart from like the AEC, which is a gift premium. Japan also needs a little bit of help with this. It does have the Type 89, but it still needs some through the tiers, which aren't Chaffies or Bulldogs, and, and they should have something. And then you have other nations, like Italy seems pretty good with it, with all their scout cars, but Britain definitely needs a little bit of help, and so does Germany. So here are a few vehicles that would be nice to see. You know, of course, you've got the Weasel, which you see in front of you. It could be mounted with many different things, 20mm, the hot missile, the hot missile launcher, the tow missile launcher, and alongside that, you also have, of course, the Marder, the Marder IFV, which we do have its chassis in game. The Florak actually has the Marder chassis, so all you would have to do is stick a tow on top of it, or stick a hot missile on top of it, and there you go. You have yourself the wonderful IFV, the Marder. So once again, adding to stuff like the Baglet, which would be very nice, but we still need more stuff in that like rank 4, rank 3 region, and I think that's where the Weasel would come in, even though the Weasel would be incredibly powerful with its 80 GM. But we do need to have a think about a light vehicle for that area. Maybe even something like the, a lot of people have brought up the VK1602, which could definitely happen. But I'm not sure about its made status. I think they made a chassis for it and not really a lot else, so I personally wouldn't like to see it, but I know that there are other things like the looks, if you want to give it the 20mm, that you could up tier and be effective. Of course, the Scorpion tank needs to have a mention. The machine, which for me would be really fun to play around rank 4/rank 5, 6, 7, 7-0. Of course, having the Hesh on it, and really not a lot else, but it's got it's got the Spud gun. We're not talking about the one with the long 90mm, but it's fast, it's nippy, doesn't have a lot of armor, but would be really fun to see for Britain as one of its first scout vehicles at the higher tiers. The other one is, of course, the ELC series, the ELC even 90s. You've got this one you see before you, armed with a 90mm, 2 crew, of course. You know, you've got the commander and then the driver. You also have other machines, such as the one which has the 4 recoilless rifles, the one which has the Nord 80 GMs on it, which is incredibly dangerous. Then, of course, you have others which only have a single barrel when it comes to the 90mm. So, yeah, I think you could definitely add the ELC series in. Even though they're all prototypes, they were all built and they were all tested, and they would fit the mold of a reconnaissance vehicle in War Thunder itself. The next one is an idea I haven't fully fleshed out, but it is definitely something I'm interested in, and I do have a few theories of how it could work. So, passive scouting being introduced with help of radar. So, what I mean by radar is the idea of either using the mechanic of radar in the game or using a form of air superiority to try and get, some form of scouting. The only way that you could make it so it wouldn't be crazy abusable, because obviously if you just set it up with the radar mechanic and anything was spotted which was on the radar, that would be incredibly oppressive to whatever team is against that, especially if one team has their superiority. So instead, I thought of the idea and discussed it with a few of the members of kind of having an area of effect where you can scout vehicles in a specific area for a very short amount of time. So see it as you pick an area on the battlefield just like you would artillery, but instead it would be a circle where you can scout. So you hit the scout button, you scout the area. After 5 seconds, it pops up where the enemies are for 1 second and then disappears again. So you get a very brief view of where the enemies are in that area. And it doesn't have to be exact, you know, kind of like how scouting isn't exact with its targeting and where the arrow is, but it will give you a brief idea of where the enemies are in the sector. Now, depending on how large that sector is, or depending on many other factors, it would be definitely a boom or bust mechanic. But I think it could definitely be a way that you could introduce stuff like scout helicopters, because you would just give them a larger radius for them to be able to scout, therefore they'd be a bit more useful. But as I said, this idea is a little bit undercooked, in my opinion. I think I definitely have to think about it a little bit more, but I would like to see at least an expansion or refinement of radar and its intermingling with other mechanics to see how it's going to work. The next one is the Build-A-Bear event. So I know a lot of people didn't like Battlefield Engineer. I also, by the end, came to despise it, not because of the actual event, but because of how the setup was when it came to the market and how you were forced to use the market to even think about finishing the event. So for me, I would like this style of event, but over a longer period of time, and instead of it being, you know, a event, make it like the squadron vehicles, so it's something that you grind out over time passively. So instead of just researching one vehicle in the tech tree, you can research that, you can research a squadron vehicle, and you could also research parts for a Build-A-Bear vehicle. You know, we already showed in the Battlefield Engineer event that you can test drive vehicles, work out what's wrong with them. You can gain parts just through battles, especially special parts and stuff like that. Maybe you could link some challenges to it, you know, get so many amount of kills. Maybe you get a boost in the amount of parts that you get, but make it just a long-term event without a time limit, so people will just grind it over time. And that means that if you make them very hard to get, well, that's completely fine. You know, there isn't too much of an issue with that, because eventually you're just going to grind them anyway. It's just another thing for people to work towards, which isn't the general monotonous grind of War Thunder. And when you are rewarding somebody with parts and rewarding someone with special things, such as these vehicles over time, they're going to be much more responsive to the game when stuff is coming out. And also, you know, if you wanted to coupon it, you could put it on the Gaijin market. I'd personally not do that, though. Just like with squadron vehicles, I think there should be a personal achievement, not a collective one. So yeah, I would love to see something like that implemented. But I think a lot of people are very sour from this event, meaning that the idea, hopefully, the idea might be dead in the water, but I hope it isn't. It shouldn't be in such a small timed event. Like, it shouldn't be an 11-day event. It should be like a 3-month or 6-month event. The next one is squadron vehicles. So we've had 3 squadron vehicles added: the Firecrest, the M901, and also the PR35. I've had fun in the Firecrest and also the PR35, and the M901 I'm now, you know, getting the experience for. So soon, or at least, you know, in the next few months, it would be nice to see some new squadron vehicles, you know. And I know a lot of people want to over-research the other ones, but more the merrier, in effect. It's just another thing to work towards. So if you want to do them in batches of 3, then it would be lovely just to see more. Here is an example of one which I think would fit pretty well. It's the J5N1. We have the J5N2, I believe, in game. It came in the last update, I believe. But the other one, the other J5, which we don't have, actually has access to what looks like Shrug music, which would make it a hell of a lot of fun, and also a very interesting squadron vehicle. So yeah, we need to have a look at squadron vehicles from nations which don't have one. So we know the Soviets have one, the British have one, the Americans have one. Therefore, it's time to create one for the Germans, the Italians, the French, and of course the Japanese. And this would be a Japanese one, in my opinion. The next idea would be, once again, improving the Warbond shop. So adding more stuff to it, bringing back old decals in the form of boxes, bringing back old decorations in the form of boxes. If you want to see the full video on it, I would definitely recommend it, because I go through a lot of different ideas that could be implemented in the game in this 40-minute video. There is a lot to it, but it is just I even talk about a way of implementing like the blueprints in when it comes to the Battlefield Engineer event or the Build-A-Bear event in the Warbond system. So yeah, I'd definitely say check that out just to get some opinions on how to improve the Warbond shop going forward. The next one is, of course, mine layers. So we had the test with the VS8. I had a lot of fun with it. I thought there was very minor issues when it came to the machine. The only problem is, how do you come back from a place of when one team has dominated the first 2 or 3 minutes of a battle, because machines like the VS8 can just stop you going towards stuff like cap zones, especially in the larger tiers of stuff. So therefore that has to at least be thought about. But overall, I thought it was a really fun experience. It was a fun machine, and also it would be nice to see more for more nations. So therefore, I would like to see a thrust into the mechanic of mine laying for Naval. I would actually much prefer this over any new, new vehicles, since we already have vehicles which could mine lay in the game. The next one is, of course, Enlisted. Enlisted last year, we got a bunch of videos looking at how the gameplay worked and all of this wonderful stuff, and we've also had a trickle of news information when it comes to it. So we've had, the GDC's talk, the real-time global illumination for larger scenes. Hopefully that comes to War Thunder, but also the Battle for Moscow and the Anton Yudintsev talking about how it's going to work with NVIDIA. But the main thing for me is I would love to see a OBT for Enlisted, an open beta test, so we can get our hands on it and work out how it's going to work for the individuals who are playing it. I'm still interested in how its business model is supposed to work, because I'm still trying to work out how they actually make money from this, apart from the initial crowdfunding campaign. So we'll have to see what that is, but I think this would be a perfect time to introduce an OBT, or an open beta test, and get more and more people involved. Anyway, those are my hopes for Gamescom 2019. If you agree, wonderful. If you disagree, wonderful as well. Let me know what you want to see when it comes to Gamescom 2019. Let's have discussions about what would be great to see. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Blackie, Daniel Stanton, John Ryman, Martinez, Moxie, Alobralo, Super Cacti, Grisvolk, Elove Goat, and Seductive Trash Can for supporting the channel.